There is a particular kind of exhaustion that lives in the minds of people who replay conversations long after they have ended. A conversation passes. The moment is over. But in their minds, the conversation continues, replaying again and again, analyzed from every angle, examined for hidden meaning, dissected for mistakes. They lie awake at night running through dialogue. They shower thinking about what was said. They drive thinking about what should have been said instead. The conversation becomes a loop, playing and replaying, and with each replay comes a different interpretation, a different possibility, a different fear. Hours pass, days pass, and still the conversation plays on. They know at some level that this endless replay will not change the past, but their minds keep searching, keep questioning, keep hoping that if they just analyze it enough, they will finally understand what happened, finally know what it meant, finally achieve the peace that keeps slipping away. Chapter 1, the loop that never ends. The conversation happened, it is finished. The other person has moved on. But the mind has not. The mind remains there, in that moment, playing and replaying the dialogue like a song stuck on repeat. Every word, every pause, every tone, every expression. The person lies in bed trying to sleep, and instead they are there again, in that conversation, analyzing it. What did I say? No, I said this. But they responded like this, which might have meant that. Or did it mean something else? The ruminator searches their memory looking for clues. They rewrite the conversation in their mind, trying different versions, testing different interpretations. What if I had said it differently? Would that have changed their reaction? There is an urgency to this replaying, though the person cannot always articulate why. It feels like if they just understand the conversation correctly, if they can find the right interpretation, something will be resolved. Some wound will be healed, some fear will be eased, but understanding never comes. Instead, with each replay, new doubts emerge, new fears, new possible meanings they had not considered before. The rumination may focus on a perceived mistake. Did I say something wrong? Did I offend them? Did I come across as stupid? The person replays the conversation obsessively, searching for the moment of failure, the moment they revealed themselves as inadequate. And even when they cannot identify a specific error, they remain convinced that one exists. Something must have gone wrong. Why else would their mind keep replaying it? For others, the rumination focuses on trying to understand the other person. What did they mean by that comment? Were they upset? Were they judging me? Did they like me? The ruminator tries to read between the lines, to decode hidden meanings, to understand subtext. They become detectives, examining evidence, building theories, rejecting theories, starting over. The experience is exhausting. The mind is supposed to let go of completed interactions and move forward. But for people with rumination, the mind refuses to let go. It circles back again and again. The person finds themselves distracted at work, unable to focus because their mind is still in the conversation. They forget what someone just said because their attention is split between the present and that replayed past moment. They lie awake at night, their mind refusing to rest. There is also a sense of futility. The person knows at some level that replaying the conversation will not change it. They cannot go back and say something different. They cannot alter how the other person responded or what they thought. Yet they continue to replay anyway, driven by a force they do not fully understand. The rumination creates a narrative that the person cannot escape. With each replay, the original conversation becomes distorted, interpreted through the lens of anxiety and self-doubt. The ruminator may come to believe something very different from what was actually said. They may remember comments that were never made. They may forget context. Reality and interpretation become blurred until the person is no longer sure what actually happened. What makes this different from healthy reflection is that healthy reflection has an endpoint. A person thinks about a conversation, considers what happened, learns from it, and then moves on. But rumination has no endpoint. It loops endlessly, returning again and again to the same thoughts, the same fears, the same desperate search for meaning and certainty. The person may attempt to stop the rumination. They may tell themselves to think about something else. They may try to distract themselves with activities. But the mind keeps returning. The loop continues. And with each return, the exhaustion deepens. The person begins to wonder if there is something fundamentally wrong with them, if their mind is simply broken, if they will ever be able to let a conversation pass without this endless replaying. Chapter 2. The Seeds of Endless Replaying. The rumination that becomes such a central feature of a person's internal life does not emerge randomly. It grows from seeds planted long ago, in early relationships, in childhood experiences, in the accumulated learning of how to survive in a world that felt unpredictable or threatening. Many people who ruminate extensively have perfectionist tendencies. They have learned that worth is tied to performance, that mistakes are unacceptable, that they must be flawless to be loved. A conversation in this context becomes a performance to be analyzed. Did they perform well? Did they say the right things? Did they present themselves acceptably? For others, social anxiety is the root. These are people whose nervous systems have learned that social situations are inherently threatening, that misunderstandings could occur, that they might say something that leads to rejection. The rumination is an attempt to manage this anxiety. By understanding what happened, perhaps they can prevent future mistakes. Highly attuned, sensitive people may also be prone to rumination. These individuals are acutely aware of nuance and subtlety in human interaction. They pick up on micro-expressions, tone shifts, small changes in behavior. This sensitivity is a gift in many ways, but it can also create an endless supply of details to analyze. In a conversation, there are hundreds of tiny moments that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The sensitive person's mind cannot let them pass unexamined. Many people who ruminate have experienced early relational trauma or unpredictable caregiving. A parent whose moods were inconsistent, whose reactions were unpredictable, who punished for saying the wrong thing. Such experiences teach a child that miscommunication can have serious consequences. The child learns to be hypervigilant, to monitor every word, to search for the correct interpretation so that they can avoid the parent's anger or withdrawal. Research indicates that adults raised in environments where conflict or criticism was common often develop more pronounced rumination. Their brains learned early on that careful analysis of interactions could serve as a form of self-protection. If they could understand what was happening, perhaps they could prevent harm. There is also the simple reality that for some people, rumination provides a function. It provides the illusion of control. In a world that feels uncertain and unpredictable, the ruminator can believe that if they just analyze enough, understand enough, they can prevent future pain. The rumination is painful, yes, but it feels safer than the alternative. Accepting that human interactions are inherently uncertain, that misunderstandings happen, that there is no amount of analysis that can fully control how others perceive you. The seeds of rumination are also watered by culture and technology. In modern life, people are encouraged to talk about their feelings, to process their experiences. For people prone to rumination, this can be twisted into endless self-analysis and internal replaying. Additionally, the smartphone and constant connectivity means that a person can be texting about a conversation or reviewing a social media interaction while simultaneously ruminating about a different conversation. Family patterns also play a role. A parent who ruminated extensively may have modeled this thinking pattern for their children. The child learned not just through direct experience, but through observation. This is how you think about problems. This is how you try to make sense of things. This is the normal way to process the world. What becomes clear is that rumination is not a character flaw or a personal failure. It is an adaptive response that made sense given the person's early environment and experiences. The mind learned rumination as a way to survive, as a way to try to control an uncontrollable world, as a way to prevent harm. But what once served a protective function has now become a prison. Chapter 3: The Neurobiology of the Ruminating Mind. The tendency to ruminate is not simply a matter of choice or willpower. It is deeply embedded in the structure and function of the brain. Understanding the neurobiology of rumination reveals why it feels so difficult to stop and what is actually happening in the mind when a person becomes caught in an endless loop. At the core of rumination is the default mode network, DMN, a constellation of interconnected brain regions that activate when the mind is not focused on external tasks. The DMN includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and other regions involved in self-referential processing and autobiographical memory. When the DMN is engaged, the person is essentially talking to themselves about themselves. The problem arises when the DMN becomes overactive or dysregulated. Rather than serving the adaptive function of reflection and planning, an overactive DMN becomes a source of suffering. The mind loops endlessly through self-focused thoughts. Research using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, has consistently demonstrated that individuals prone to rumination show elevated DMN activation. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive function and decision-making, also shows altered activity in people who ruminate. In healthy individuals, the prefrontal cortex can regulate the DMN, essentially telling it when to activate and when to stop. But in chronic ruminators, this regulatory function is impaired. The amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, also becomes hyperactive during rumination. This intensifies feelings of anxiety and dread, creating a feedback loop. Rumination generates anxiety, which fuels more rumination. The person becomes trapped in an escalating cycle. There's also an important antagonistic relationship between the DMN and the frontoparietal network, FPN, the brain system responsible for directed attention and cognitive control. When one is overactive, the other is typically less active. This means that when the DMN is running the rumination loop, the FPN, which would normally help the person disengage from repetitive thoughts, is suppressed. The person literally loses the neurological capacity to stop the rumination. Rumination also alters the brain's neurochemistry. Chronic rumination leads to elevated cortisol, the stress hormone, which damages brain structures over time and reinforces the ruminative pattern. Additionally, neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, which regulate mood and motivation, become dysregulated in people prone to rumination. Perhaps most importantly, rumination functions as a learned neural habit. The principle neurons that fire together, wire together, explains how repeated rumination strengthens the neural pathways associated with negative thinking. Each time a person ruminates, they reinforce these circuits, making the pattern progressively more automatic and more difficult to interrupt. The brain is essentially training itself to ruminate. This is why rumination is so difficult to control through willpower alone. The person is not simply choosing to replay the conversation, they are caught in a pattern that has become neurologically encoded. Their brain has learned rumination as a habit, and habits are not under conscious control in the same way that deliberate choices are. Research also shows that individuals with high levels of rumination have impaired inhibitory control, the ability to suppress unwanted thoughts. This means that when a ruminative thought arises, the person's brain cannot effectively tell it to stop. The thought persists and loops because the neural mechanisms that would normally interrupt it are not functioning optimally. Chapter 4: The Trap of the Search for Certainty. At the heart of rumination lies a paradox: the belief that analyzing a situation more will bring clarity and resolution, when in fact the opposite is true. Each time a person replays a conversation, hoping to finally understand it, they often end up more confused. This is because rumination operates on a false promise. The person believes, if I just think about this enough, I will finally understand what happened. And once I understand, I will feel at peace. But understanding never comes. Or more accurately, understanding comes and goes. One moment the person is convinced they understand exactly what the other person meant. The next moment, doubt creeps in. Perhaps they misinterpreted. Perhaps there was another meaning entirely. The ruminator is searching for certainty. In a domain where certainty does not exist, human communication is inherently ambiguous. Words can have multiple meanings. Intentions are not always clear. People sometimes say things they do not mean. People sometimes hide their true feelings. There is no amount of analysis that can extract perfect understanding from an inherently ambiguous interaction. Yet the ruminator keeps trying, and with each attempt, they create new possibilities for doubt and confusion. They may remember the conversation slightly differently each time they replay it. Details shift, emphasis changes. What was certain becomes uncertain. The ruminator's own memories become less reliable because each replay potentially alters the memory. Rumination also provides a false sense of control. The person believes that by analyzing the conversation, they are protecting themselves. Perhaps if they understand what went wrong this time, they can prevent it from happening again. But the reality is that rumination does not improve performance or prevent future problems. In fact, rumination typically makes things worse. Studies show that people who ruminate extensively about social interactions actually show worse social outcomes over time. There is also the phenomenon of rumination maintaining anxiety. Rather than reducing anxiety as the person hopes it will, rumination actually amplifies it. Each replay of a conversation with a slight worry about whether they said something wrong intensifies the worry. The person becomes more convinced that they made a mistake, more anxious about the judgment of the other person, more preoccupied with the interaction. The ruminator is also often operating from distorted thinking. Their perception of the conversation becomes increasingly negative with each replay. Comments that were neutral may come to feel harsh. Innocent comments may be reinterpreted as critical. The person's focus narrows, becoming more attuned to potential signs of rejection or judgment and less attuned to neutral or positive aspects of the interaction. Rumination also prevents genuine problem solving. There is a difference between healthy reflection on a situation and rumination. Healthy reflection leads to insights and action. A person thinks about what happened, identifies what they might do differently, and then moves on. Rumination, by contrast, is passive and circular. It does not lead anywhere. It does not generate solutions. It simply loops. For people with perfectionism, rumination becomes tied to shame. The more they analyze, the more they become convinced that they failed to meet their own impossibly high standards. They find evidence of inadequacy in every interaction. This shame further reinforces the rumination, creating a vicious cycle. The person may also become resistant to feedback or perspective that contradicts their rumination. If a friend tells them, "I did not think you said anything wrong," the person may dismiss this as the friend trying to be nice, or may focus on one small detail that they believed indicated criticism, reinforcing their original interpretation. Chapter 5. The exhaustion becomes unbearable. There comes a moment when the cost of rumination becomes undeniable. The person realizes that they have spent hours, or days, or weeks replaying the same conversation over and over. They have checked their phone repeatedly, rereading messages, looking for hidden meanings. They have lost sleep. They have struggled to focus at work. They have brought the rumination into their relationships with others, seeking reassurance, asking friends whether they think they said something wrong. The turning point often arrives not as a single moment, but as a gradual accumulation of awareness. The person notices that the rumination has not brought them peace. It has not resolved their anxiety. It has not changed the past or altered the other person's perception, and yet they continue to ruminate anyway, driven by a force they do not feel they can control. Some people reach a turning point through noticing the impact on their functioning. Sleep suffers. Concentration deteriorates. They miss important events because their mind was elsewhere, caught in rumination. Relationships suffer because they are not fully present. Work suffers because they cannot focus. The person realizes that the rumination, which they believed was protecting them, is actually harming them. Others reach the turning point through the exhaustion becoming too heavy to bear. The constant replaying, the endless searching for meaning, the circular thinking, it is simply too much. The person becomes tired, not just physically tired, though that often accompanies it, but mentally, emotionally tired. The fatigue that comes from maintaining an impossible vigilance, from refusing to let a conversation end, from fighting against the natural process of moving forward. For some, the turning point comes through social connection. A friend or therapist asks, "Why are you still thinking about this? It happened 3 days ago. Let it go." And in that moment, the person is confronted with the reality. They cannot let it go. They have been unable to let it go despite their desperate wish to do so. This recognition that the rumination is beyond their control is itself a turning point. There may also be a moment of clarity where the person recognizes the self-fulfilling nature of their rumination. By constantly replaying conversations and imagining rejection, by maintaining a narrative of their own inadequacy, they may actually bring about the very outcomes they fear. People sense their anxiety and uncertainty. Relationships falter not because of what was said in the original conversation, but because the ruminator's anxious energy has contaminated the ongoing interaction. The turning point is not always pleasant. It may come with shame at having wasted so much time and energy. It may come with grief at all the present moments that were lost to rumination about the past. It may come with fear. If the rumination is not protecting them, what is? What will happen if they let it go? But the turning point is also the moment when change becomes possible. As long as the person believes that rumination is helping, that it is protecting them, that it will eventually bring understanding, they continue. But when the illusion is shattered, when they realize that rumination is a trap, not a tool, they become motivated to find another way. Chapter 6. Breaking free from the loop. Healing from rumination requires understanding that the goal is not to eliminate thinking about past conversations entirely, but to change the relationship with those thoughts and to gradually rewire the neural patterns that maintain the habit. Rumination-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, RFCBT, is an evidence-based approach specifically designed to target rumination. Rather than trying to change the content of thoughts, RFCBT helps the person recognize rumination as a habit, a learned pattern, and teaches them to interrupt the habit before it spirals. The approach involves functional analysis, understanding what the rumination is trying to achieve, and experiential exercises that help break the ruminative cycle. Mindfulness is particularly effective because it teaches the person to observe their thoughts without getting caught in them. Rather than engaging with a ruminative thought, analyzing it and building an entire narrative around it, the person learns to notice the thought and let it pass, like a cloud moving across the sky. Self-compassion directly opposes rumination. While rumination is characterized by self-judgment, criticism, and harsh evaluation, self-compassion involves treating oneself with kindness and understanding. Research shows that self-compassion is highly effective at reducing rumination and the anxiety and depression that accompany it. Behavioral activation helps interrupt the rumination cycle by shifting focus from internal repetitive thinking to external activities and engagement. When a person feels the pull of rumination, engaging in a meaningful activity helps break the loop. Cognitive restructuring teaches the person to examine their ruminative thoughts more objectively. Is this thought actually true? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? By gently challenging the accuracy of ruminative thoughts, the person can reduce their emotional charge and power. Grounding techniques, such as the 5-4-3-2-1 technique, where the person identifies 5 things they can see, 4 they can hear, 3 they can feel, 2 they can smell, and 1 they can taste, can interrupt rumination by anchoring the person in the present moment. Somatic approaches recognize that rumination is stored in the body as tension and dysregulation. Practices like progressive muscle relaxation, breath work, and yoga can help calm the nervous system and reduce the physiological activation that maintains rumination. Setting a specific time for worrying, allowing the person to worry about concerns during a designated period rather than throughout the day, can paradoxically help reduce rumination. This technique gives the mind permission to worry while also setting boundaries. It is important to recognize that breaking the rumination habit takes time and practice. The neural pathways are well established, and they do not disappear overnight. But with consistent practice of these techniques, the brain can gradually rewire itself. New pathways form. The rumination becomes less frequent, less intense, less automatic. Chapter 7. The freedom of moving forward. There is a particular kind of peace that arrives when a person finally stops replaying a conversation. Not because they have achieved perfect understanding of what happened, not because they have proven to themselves that they did not make a mistake, but because they have simply let it go. This letting go does not happen all at once. It is gradual. The person finds themselves replaying the conversation, and then partway through, they remember, I have already thought about this 100 times. Nothing new will emerge, and they gently redirect their attention to the present moment. When a person breaks free from rumination, they reclaim their mind. The mental space that was occupied by endless replaying becomes available for genuine reflection, creativity, presence, and joy. They can have a conversation without simultaneously analyzing every word they said. They can interact with others without being preoccupied with how they were perceived. They also come to understand something profound. Certainty about how others perceive them is not actually possible or necessary. Human communication is inherently ambiguous. People will sometimes misunderstand. They will sometimes judge. But this is not a reflection of the person's worth. It is simply part of being human, part of living in relationship with other imperfect humans. The person who has healed from rumination learns to live with uncertainty. They no longer need to understand every nuance of every interaction. They trust that most misunderstandings will either be resolved through gentle future conversation or do not matter as much as their ruminating mind insisted they did. They develop a different kind of confidence, not confidence that they will always say the right thing or never be misunderstood, but confidence that they can survive the misunderstanding. Their rejection, if it comes, is not fatal, that their worth is not contingent on perfect communication. The freedom from rumination also allows for more genuine presence in relationships. Without the divided attention of rumination, the person can actually be with others. They can listen more fully. They can respond more authentically. They can enjoy conversations rather than analyze them. Perhaps most importantly, the person learns that the peace they were searching for through rumination was never going to come from rumination. Peace comes from acceptance, from letting go, from trusting that the past cannot be changed no matter how many times it is replayed, from learning to live in the present moment rather than being trapped in the past. The mind that once replayed conversations endlessly now replays them occasionally, with less urgency and less pain. And eventually some conversations simply pass. They end, and the mind moves on. The person has reclaimed their most valuable resource, their present moment. And in that reclamation, they find the freedom they have been seeking all along. End of script. References. 3 reasons behind our compulsion to replay conversations mentally. Post-event rumination and social anxiety. A systematic review. The neuroscience of overthinking explained. 5 reasons you replay conversations in your head by a psychologist. Study shows that if you've been ruminating, it's likely worsening your social anxiety. Signs you may be ruminating. Why you replay conversations for days and what it says about you. Stuck in the aftermath of social anxiety and rumination. Rumination and over-recruitment of cognitive control circuits. Constantly replaying past conversations. Trait rumination and social anxiety separately influence repetitive negative thinking and nervous system function, social anxiety and overthinking. Why you replay every conversation. Psychological interventions for pre-event and post-event rumination, the brain mechanics of rumination and repetitive thinking. Self-help to stop rumination. Stop rumination vertical bar repetitive thoughts. Neural correlates of rumination and depression. What is rumination? Understanding the process. What is post-event rumination? Evaluating the effectiveness of mindfulness-based interventions. Overcoming rumination with CBT resilience techniques. Self-compassion. A better alternative to rumination. Mindfulness-based interventions for the treatment of rumination. CBT tips to overcome rumination and obsessive thinking. Mindfulness for rumination vertical bar expert-backed practices. Mindfulness-based interventions Elsevier. 12 tips to help you stop ruminating. The effectiveness of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Rumination-focused cognitive behavioral therapy reduces. How self-compassion beats rumination. The effectiveness of mindfulness-based interventions for rumination. How CBT addresses rumination. Rumination, perfectionism, and trauma. Mindfulness and depressive symptoms. Mediating role of rumination. How can CBT stop repetitive rumination and worry cycles? Healing core fears. The power of self-compassion as exposure. Rumination and self-compassion moderate mindfulness.